Hi, everyone. I'm Gail Miller, a senior advisor at Brookfield Asset Management. I've spent much of my career in leading policy roles in California, working on clean energy and infrastructure finance programs. Today, we're revisiting one of the most existential and critical themes of our time, the decarbonization theme. And this is a special episode looking at how to accelerate the transition investment in emerging markets. We also are going to talk a little bit about the opportunities that we see from COP. And finally, the way that we can really galvanize and transform through collaboration. Our guest today is His Excellency Ambassador Majid Al-Zuwaidi, Director General of COP28 and CEO of Altera, which is the world's largest climate finance fund. Also returning for his second Brookfield podcast is Mark Carney, Head of Transition Investing and Chair of Brookfield Asset Management and the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance, among many other roles ensuring successful decarbonization around the world. This is an incredible opportunity to learn from two of the world's leaders in transition finance. Ambassador Mark, thank you so much for joining. If we could start with you, Mark, what is your personal journey into the world of climate finance?
Well, I guess like many of us, it comes to me at a couple of levels. On the personal front, I was born in the north of Canada, Northwest Territories, and on a place just on the northern end of something called Wood Buffalo National Park. So it was, in effect, the last of the buffalo. So there used to be tens of millions of buffalo that roamed the plains, and they were down to literally the hundreds. When I look over the course of my life as a whole, become aware that we've seen almost a 70% decline in the wildlife population over the period. Now, I've been alive now for a long time, but that is a disturbing number. To bring it into finance, where my focus, the financial impact of those changes really came to me when I was governor of the Bank of England, and as part of those responsibilities overseeing Lloyd's of London, the largest and most sophisticated reinsurance market. And in that, recognizing that those extreme weather events that had been in the tails of the distribution a few years ago were coming into the central scenario that was going to increasingly affect finance. And as a consequence of that, really started to work much more closely with international regulators, policymakers, and I've continued that work as I've left central banking as a UN Special Envoy.
The commitment to service that you bring, Mark, Ambassador, just your journey to this is also one of service as well as understanding the huge challenge ahead. So if you could tell us how you came to work on these issues.
Yeah, Gail, first of all, thank you for the wonderful introduction. I think that I come to climate a little bit by accident. I was a geologist in the oil and gas sector in my past. And as you know, I became the chief negotiator for the UAE and went on a little bit of a journey to the Paris Agreement. And I worked on the SDGs. I worked at the UN on a lot of the sustainability agenda, particularly up to 2015 and the Paris Climate Agenda. And through that, I learned a lot about climate change, which I kind of already knew from my geology days in university, but also about how climate is something that impacts not just us from the perspective of a climate changing environment, but also something that has economic implications, has sustainable development implications, has implications across the board when it comes to how we think about how our development models are deployed. And in the UAE, that becomes something that's really at the heart of what we do. We used to be a country, before we had oil and gas, that depended on the pearl trade, for example. And then overnight, the artificial pearl was created, and it led to a complete destruction of that economy that financed a lot of my grandfather and his generation of people. So when they discovered oil and gas, they saw it from that same perspective as a natural resource that we're blessed to have today, but that a natural resource that could be replaced by a new technology. And so for me, that's how I came to this point today, is through this journey that I took to understand that climate change is not only about us needing to be responsible as a community, as a global community, but also because we're moving towards a future where new technologies, new sources of energy, new ways of living really mean that we can do that in a sustainable and environmentally responsible way.
Wow, that's incredible. So what we're going to talk about is how all the opportunities really are in front of us. And that despite, I think, some of what we hear, there's obviously not a lot of noise around this issue. Mark, I would love for you to talk to us about the optimism on our global journey to net zero.
I think it's important to recognize that while the challenge is enormous, if we go back to the Paris Accord, the run rate of investment in clean energy was about half the pace of investment on an annual basis as in conventional oil and gas. Now, last year, that run rate of investment for clean energy, all aspects of clean energy, was almost twice as large as conventional oil and gas. So just under $2 trillion of investment in clean energy that we have seen. So there's a tremendous increase in the deployment globally of clean energy. Just to provide one other fundamental positive development is that in those economies where capital is being deployed at scale, the developed economies, the G7, the OECD economies, we are now seeing emissions start to fall. Emissions actually fell in the advanced economies alone, 4.5% last year, despite the fact that those economies were growing just under 2%. And we actually have the overall level of emissions in the advanced economies approaching levels that were last seen 50 years ago. So even those economies have grown tremendously, they are much, much less energy intensive. So that emissions curve has absolutely bent and is headed in the right direction, even though we've had what one might term a global stress test for climate in the last 5 years. We've had a pandemic, an energy crisis. We have a much more challenging geopolitical environment. And the response to all of that has been to accelerate the transition. The global challenge we have is that this needs to happen everywhere. We're seeing that it can be done. We're seeing that it is being done, but we need to globalize it. And that's part of why we've teamed up and are working under the UAE's leadership.
Thank you, Mark. Well, speaking about meeting the global challenge and leadership in that regard, Ambassador, you were the Director General for COP28 and CEO of Altera that we'll learn more about in this conversation. What objectives did you set?
Yeah, Gail, thanks. Our leadership, when we started out on the journey of COP and when I became Director General alongside our now COP President, we wanted to bring an honest and practical approach to climate, to address the challenges that we saw, and to do that in a very practical, realistic way. We spent the year traveling around the world, visiting anybody and everybody we could, making great friends. And one of those great friends that we met was Mark and his team. Mark has brought great leadership to the climate discussion, and I think that we should all give him kudos for the great work that he's done over the years. I know that I personally learned a lot from spending time with Mark and other climate leaders to understand, well, what are the challenges? So our goal for COP was, what could we do to bring people together to really focus the mind and to drive action that would get us back on track to achieving that 1.5 degree goals. I also recognized that the single biggest challenge we saw and what we heard time and time and time again was that finance was the clear issue that we needed to address. We know that we have estimates that we need to achieve about $2 trillion in annual investment in climate finance to reach our 1.5 degree goals. We know that we need to get from the private sector about $1 trillion of that. We also know that there's a huge imbalance between the investment that's happening in the global north, in the industrialized world, versus what is happening in the developing world. So since most of the growth is happening in the developing world, most of the growth in emissions is happening in the developing world, we need to flip that equation. We need to flip the balance of investment to favor the developing world. And I think that for us at COP28, the main objective was to really change that narrative, the sort of overarching objective. And we did that in a very systematic way. We got the loss and damage fund. We delivered the global stocktake. We delivered excellent partnerships in terms of the declarations that were there. We mobilized capital in various ways. And I know we'll talk about Altera later. And we got the UAE consensus, which was the overall package that for the first time mentioned the fact that we all want to collectively move away from fossil fuels and that we want to work towards that. It's crazy to think that after 28 COPs, it took 28 COPs for us to get that reference.
Thank you very much. Mark, just before we move on, do you want to just say a few words about COP28 and the opportunity?
Yeah, I would actually. And let me start with a point on leadership. It's often said in military terms, leaders run towards gunfire. You go to where the problems are the greatest. And one of the things that was tremendously exciting and I think ultimately so effective about COP28 in Dubai was the focus on the toughest issues. So we're talking a lot about, and rightly so, emerging markets and developing country finance. I'll come back to that. But let me give another related example, which is the so-called heavy emitting sectors, steel, cement, shipping, air transportation. Collectively, these sectors count for almost a third of global emissions. These are the tough issues to solve. And what was set up at COP28 was a remarkable coalition, the Industrial Transition Accelerator, which brings together all the relevant actors, the companies, the standard setters, the major economies in order to solve the hard problems. So that's one example. Second example is what the ambassador just said, which is to address the issue around acknowledging the need to transition away from fossil fuels. And the way these negotiations work and the way the global consensus works is once you acknowledge things and you set objectives, then the architecture gets built around those. And if you do it right, change accelerates. The third big issue is there has been tremendous progress. We need to do more, I recognize, but there has been tremendous progress in the developed economies. I referenced some of the emissions coming down. There's been tremendous progress in China in terms of developing the industries and reducing their emissions relative to where they would have gone otherwise. But there is a huge portion of the world, the emerging and developing world, where there has not been that progress. There has not been the flow of that capital, where that additional $2 trillion per year is needed. That's a hard problem. It's been a hard problem. But if you solve a hard problem, you create a tremendous opportunity. You create an opportunity to deploy capital at scale and make returns because you're solving one of the biggest challenges that faces humanity. And that is the transition, the transformation that is happening now and very much catalyzed by COP28.
So speaking of the growing focus on, and Mark, what you just said about the huge challenge in emerging markets, and we're really starting to see more and more focus on international summits. Why are we seeing more focus on the emerging markets, and what is the opportunity there?
Well, we're seeing more focus because, quite simply, the COP presidency has put it squarely in the sight. Leadership is about setting priorities, and the focus is rightly going to, I'll call it, with respect, non-China emerging and developing economies that are responsible for roughly a third of global emissions, but a proportion of global emissions that is compounding very rapidly. So that's the first reason. The second is that the solutions there require real innovation. We can't just rely on the market to deliver the solutions in the time that is allowed by the carbon budget. So we need to accelerate things, and we need to have partnerships. Some of those partners will come from the multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank. They need to change in order to be more effective. And that is now acknowledged increasingly by their leading shareholders and by the management. And that process of change is underway. What we're seeing as well is that there is an opportunity. Again, I want to focus on the opportunity. There is an opportunity to leapfrog for these countries the energy systems. They don't need to build out a legacy system that will become obsolete as the climate transition moves forward. They can help end energy poverty, become more sustainable, and become more competitive in a global economy by building out clean energy. And I'll come back to where I started. By making this a top priority, the UAE presidency is focusing the minds of institutions to solve this. And I think we can play a real leadership and catalytic role by providing real solutions for real investments now that we hope others are going to copy, quite frankly, because that's the way we're going to get scale.
Absolutely. And they need to copy in order to meet the $2 trillion challenge. So we talk a lot about the opportunity in emerging markets, and we'll get to energy demand and why that's a huge opportunity as well. Can you talk a little bit about the risks that'll affect the pace of transition, especially in some of the countries we're talking about?
Well, there are a few sets of risks. First, and I'm speaking obviously in general terms, but there are macro risks. I'm still enough of a former central banker that I think about macro risks. So currency volatility, limited fiscal space for these governments. In addition to those macro risks, there are, I'll call them micro issues, which is the regulatory frameworks, the policy frameworks, and the track records of both of those are very early stage. And that's something that can be accelerated, but needs to be accelerated. Third point I'd make is just familiarity. Maybe it's not an obvious point, but major investors need to become familiar with jurisdictions, with countries in order to make major investments in them. There has to be a reason. This is part of the element of being catalytic. You need to provide a reason to get the focus, create the opportunity, and bring everything together.
I think it's important to understand that the climate process is called a process for a reason. Changing how we use fuel, how we use energy, how we live, how we develop, how we grow, that's not something that we can solve with one COP. And it has to be done through a process. And by the way, also, because our environment is interconnected, no one country can solve the problem by itself. And that's why we as the UAE, which is our global hub, we're a relatively small country, but interconnected with the global community, we could do all the best action in the world, but we're still less than 1% of global emissions. And so our effort would be limited if others don't come along with us. And that's why we have this sort of consensus process. That's why it's very important that we get everybody on board, because we have to bring everybody on board. We have to move together as a community.
It's an extraordinary challenge, and I'm really eager to learn from you how we can meet it anywhere, how we build faster, efficiently, cleanly. And also, are the emerging markets better equipped to allow for more building, especially for clean energy, because this is such a great opportunity for them to create jobs? Do you have thoughts on that, Ambassador?
Sure. Gail, I think that this is where there's a real opportunity. And that's where we as the UAE, we're a young country. We've been able to develop our country very rapidly. And we can build that infrastructure because we're building it new from scratch. When you're in the developed world, you are retrofitting or working on infrastructure that exists already. We know, for instance, that 85% of projected energy demand growth by 2050 is in the emerging markets and developing economies. And 67% of energy-related emissions are in those same markets. And investing in those markets will have a 30% more emissions reductions compared to much higher cost of abatement opportunities when it comes to developed countries. So having that focused on the developing world, not only from the perspective that you are building new infrastructure so you can do it in smart ways, but also the value for money, the return, if you will, per dollar that you're spending is that much greater. And so that makes it a kind of no-brainer. So that is something that we think is a real opportunity that globally we should be thinking about. But at the same time, just as you said, we're 6 years away from 2030, and we're 6 years away from missing our 1.5 degree goals. And if we don't address these challenges, guess who will be the first tool to be impacted? It will be those same developing countries who contributed the least to the problem, but are impacted the most by it. And so what are we doing to help them to build the future that we want in a clean way so that they can make those choices? They want to make the right choice. They know the technology exists. So we're not talking about technologies that need to be invented. They know the technology exists. They want to be able to access, but the financing that they have access to doesn't allow them to make the choices that they want to make. The financing only allows them to go for technologies that are tried and tested or some specifications that are defined in that way. So they're making choices that neither are good for them in terms of climate or good for them in terms of the environment, nor work properly, nor are affordable to them. And so these are the real world issues that are happening on the ground that I think that sometimes we forget about, and that, yes, through this wonderful partnership we have with Brookfield. We are working on solving these trends at a much higher kind of level. Through that process last year of traveling around and trying to understand, we came to the conclusion that finance was the biggest problem. We felt that there was kind of a gap in between the purely concessional or philanthropic capital and the private, fully commercial capital, and that was a gap that could be filled. And so then we went about designing what that would look like. We came up with Altera, the world's largest climate fund today, a 30 billion catalytic vehicle. We are using our scale to be able to incentivize both the fully commercial capital and that concessional capital to work together. We're using our scope, the fact that we can invest globally, and that we have this focus on the mobilizing capital to the global south. And we're using this unique structure that we developed. So our target is to mobilize 250 billion by 2030. And then we have two funds. One is our transformation fund, which is 5 billion committed to the global south, and then 25 billion that can invest globally across the gamut of climate investment. With Brookfield, we're developing a Global South fund, which we're very proud of. And we believe that this is really a first step in mobilizing capital to invest in the Global South. And we're really proud of the relationship we've developed and the partnership we're developing with Brookfield. And I think that you're going to see in the coming years that the impact will be huge. And we're super excited about what we can do together as organizations.
Likewise, we're very excited. Thank you very much for that. So, Mark, I'm going to turn it back to you to share some of your expertise around blended finance and why it's so important, and talk about our Catalytic Transition Fund, the partnership that Brookfield has with Altera. And also, so it's a three-part question. If you could talk more about unlocking more blended finance so that we really do get to these numbers, these $1 trillion that we've been speaking about from the beginning.
So perhaps, Gail, the best way for me to answer that is to go into maybe some of the specifics of what we call the Catalytic Transition Fund, which is our partnership between Brookfield and Altera. The essence of that is it brings in exactly what the ambassador just discussed, which is the contribution of Altera, the financial contribution. There's a much broader contribution, of course, but the financial contribution is a unique layer of capital which has a return, but a capped return, which will help ensure that other private investors in the Catalytic Transition Fund, which I'll call CTF from now on, those other private investors, it enhances their return over time. That's the financial contribution. The broader contribution is systemic. It's bringing in the broader ecosystem. We'll come back to that. First and foremost, what we have is scale. This will be the largest pool of capital dedicated to these countries. I'll call it non-China emerging and developing economies. We're mobilizing capital at scale, and that capital at scale benefits from another element of scale, which is the scale of Brookfield, one of the largest developers and operators of renewable power and clean energy solutions worldwide. We have over 3,500 employees and 20 offices globally, 150 power marketing experts, almost 7,000 generating facilities, 175 gigawatt operating and development renewable clean energy platform. So the scale is huge, and it's bringing that scale of expertise plus capital to these dedicated markets. And then it gets to the third point, which brings in the broader ecosystem, the systemic impact. The ambassador just mentioned that what the UAE is doing with Altera is fitting between concessional capital, philanthropic capital, and pure private capital. And part of what we will do in the deployment of this capital in the Catalytic Transition Fund is on a transaction by transaction basis. We will partner in certain cases with philanthropies, with MDBs, multilateral development banks, and other mechanisms as part of a blended package in order to make these transactions happen. Let me give you a specific example or an approach here. A few moments ago, we were talking about some of the challenges in the emerging economies, early stage regulatory environments, early stage so-called enabling environments, policy frameworks. There is some work that needs to be done in some of these economies in order to solve those problems. It's a lot easier to do that work if you're a multilateral development bank, some of the philanthropies providing expertise and a very small amount of financing in order to do that. Their motivation to do that is greatly helped by the prospects of literally hundreds of millions of dollars that's ready to be deployed by entities such as the Catalytic Transition Fund. And in working in partnership, you can prime the pump, help get the regulatory frameworks and the project development work done. The capital comes in behind it, things get built up. And that's another S, which I'm going to emphasize, which is we don't just need scale, which we have. This systemic impact by bringing in partners, and scale helps with that, but we also need speed. Addressing climate change is about speed. The very moving examples that the ambassador gave, these people deserve solutions now, and we need to deliver them, those solutions. And by bringing this together at such a scale with the relationships, with the partners, with the proven operating professionals, this is ultimately about engineering and construction and solutions. So you need that expertise, and we have it. We can also accomplish that speed.
Thank you. So before I want to go this whole idea of blended finance, where we really call on everyone to come together. Can you talk a little bit more about how we get more of those players into the investment ecosystem?
I remember a wonderful roundtable that we had at COP28 where we brought together all the top financiers, global financiers, into one conversation. And what I said is, we want to bring your brightest and best financial experts to tackle what is the toughest challenge of our time in the finance. And the financial industry has been brilliant at generating and creating economic wealth for the last decades. Can we dedicate some of that brain power to solving some of these challenges? How do we make sure that we bring in development banks? How do we bring in philanthropy? How do we bring in project developers? How do we bring in different aspects of the community to tackle this in creative and innovative ways? And what we as Altera are saying is, hey, come with your ideas, come with your solutions, come with your best people, and let's try to work this out. I think that's what's been really great about Brookfield stepping up with us and saying, hey, we really want to do this together with you. And CTF is one of our first vehicles that will help to bring the best and the brightest of Brookfield's financial expertise alongside Altera and our experts to try to really move the needle and to really encourage investment in the global south.
So, Mark, will you tell us a little of the specifics of CTF, what we'll invest in, what countries you see CTF going into, and then the way that Brookfield invests across transition?
Okay, yeah. What we have is three main strategies for CTF. First is obvious clean energy. So that's building out renewables at scale, wind, solar, and beyond across a range of countries. The second is what we call business transformation. The simple version of talking about that is going where the emissions are. So this can be in heavy emitting sectors and helping them to dramatically reduce emissions. But it also, and very importantly, is going in the power sector and helping thermal power dependent companies to transition rapidly, much more rapidly to clean energy. So these will be companies that in many jurisdictions produce a lot of energy with coal. Somebody else has to help get the financing there to build the renewables up rapidly so you can shut down the coal and help make sure that transition is effective. We have a lot of experience in doing that. And we think that's an enormous opportunity. The third area is around what we call sustainable solutions. That can be electrification of transportation. It is renewable natural gas, biofuels adoption. It can be carbon sequestration, hydrogen solutions as well in critical areas. And very importantly, a huge double win for these economies, if you will, which is in some cases is going to be to build out manufacturing backed by green power, including in some of the larger jurisdictions, manufacturing of the components for green energy itself. I'll finish with this, which is that this is about outcomes. It's about providing clean energy and clean solutions to the people that the ambassador referred to across a huge range of humanity, a huge range of jurisdictions. It is also at the same time about another outcome, which is reducing carbon. That's what's driving climate change. That's what's making life. And I said that was my last point, but I just want to reemphasize something. The opportunity here is to catalyze this change in these economies. It's to catalyze other partners, whether they're multilateral development banks, philanthropies, other private investors, to come to the solutions. And it's to catalyze a change in the system as a whole. So when the ambassador spoke earlier about the commitments, the 25 billion potentially crowding in 250 billion of overall capital, we expect that that is what's going to happen with that money. But I think that understates the catalytic impact of what the UAE is doing here, because we are setting up vehicles that are going to help transition the system, transform the system, and others are going to imitate. And I mean that in the absolute best sense of the word, and imitate and maybe innovate on top of that as well. And so the impact is going to be that much greater, which is fantastic, because we're all very mindful of that $2 trillion number that we started with and how much of a broader impact we need to make.
Mark, you spoke about success being defined by scale, speed, and systemic impact. I think we've also spoken a lot about collaboration and crowding and more capital. Ambassador, I'd love for you to talk about ways that you would call this partnership a success and how we can really hold ourselves accountable to that.
As Mark said, we're committing a large pool of capital through CTF and other parts of Brookfield's climate strategies. And from our point of view, the fact that we have the best and the brightest of Brookfield focused on how to deploy capital in the global south is exactly what we wanted to do. We can't forget what this is about. This is about the emissions and the impact that it's going to have. In that respect, I like to think we're already successful, and I am looking forward to us achieving a lot more together through this partnership, particularly as we start to deploy on the ground to real projects that make a difference in people's lives.
And just to your earlier point, the economic opportunities for the people we're talking about. The one thing I'd add, and what I'm hoping that part of our shared definition of success is that we create a blueprint that folks can replicate. That this is such an extraordinary success that another $2 trillion of capital come in to say, you know what, this works, we're going to do it too. So that is my hope.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important point, Gail. One of the things that we wanted to say at the outset was that we wanted to prove that investing in climate and investing in the global south in particular made economic sense to people.
Absolutely. And stepping up to this responsibility is absolutely true, and creating this scalable model. Ambassador and Mark Carney, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about all of this today. It really is a critical challenge to crack, and it's so positive to hear about practical solutions and the extraordinary opportunity that is before us to solve the world's $2 trillion problem. We hope that you have enjoyed listening to the podcast. To learn more, you can find previous episodes of the Brookfield Perspectives podcast on all major audio platforms or the Brookfield website. Thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you again to the Ambassador and Mark Carney.
Audiation.